And I think one of the things we all need to do better is communicate with the American public that the essence of capitalism, free enterprise, and entrepreneurship is serving other people well. And if you do it, you're rewarded. If you do it well, you're rewarded well. And if you don't do it well, you're immediately punished and you either get better or you go out of business.
Hello, welcome to another episode of the Let People Prosper Show. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, we like to bring on a lot of different guests from entrepreneurs, for public policy, for you, the audience, who are a lot of legislators and think tankers and just general audience. It's really a pleasure to have you all on. And today I'm delighted to bring on someone who knows a lot about all those things and a lot more. And it's none other than John Tillman. John, welcome to the Let People Prosper Show.
It's so great to be with you. There's nothing better than prosperity, both of the human type as well as the monetary type.
Well, amen. Amen. I agree with that. And prosperity should be more holistic. And that's the way I look at it. I don't look at it just from a material things. That's important. But there's also spiritual and educational and so many other things. So we'll talk about that more together.
Yes.
Before we jump into this, though, let me go ahead and give the audience your bio, and then we'll get into it. So John Tillman is one of the nation's most prominent leaders in the free market public policy arena. He is CEO of American Culture Project, an organization that attracts, educates, and mobilizes independent voters around the ideas of freedom and opportunity. He is best known for building the Illinois Policy Institute, also known as IPI, as we might mention throughout this discussion, which he currently chairs, into one of the most influential state-based think tanks in the country, where he was CEO from 2007 to 2021. IPI was a key part of the coalition that defeated Governor Pritzker's progressive income tax in 2020. He is also co-founder and chairman of Ironlight, a full-service, for-profit digital marketing agency, which does work for more than 75 nonprofits across the conservative public policy space. He's also doing a lot of other things that we're going to talk about today, including museum, of all things. So before we get into all that, though, John, I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Let me go ahead and ask you the first question I do with all my guests. Why do you do what you do every day?
Well, I'm the guy that when I was 9 years old, and people can do the math on this and figure it out, who watched both 1968 political conventions gavel to gavel and thought it was highly entertaining and became a political junkie and paid a lot of attention to politics from that moment on, and eventually was a political science minor, a journalism major in college before switching to business later on. Can't make back in those days, you couldn't make much money in journalism. There was not really a concept of celebrity journalism. So I went into business after that, but I was always very fascinated by America's founding, the free enterprise system. I grew up, my parents got divorced when I was very young, and my mom ended up having a terrible mental health issue. She was a paranoid schizophrenic and was in and out of governmentally run institutions trying to treat her for her challenges. And so we got wrapped up, my brothers and I got wrapped up in the system. And we got to see just how ineffective the government was, no matter how good the intentions, and often the intentions are not good, but even with good intentions, the systems and the incentives are just misaligned. And then I started living my business life, and I got to see in the private sector what the essence of capitalism and free enterprise was and is. And that is that an entrepreneur has an idea to start a business, puts his own money in and some sweat equity, maybe raises some money. And what's the first thing he does with that money? He hires people, and gives people meaningful work. And what does that entrepreneur and those workers do together? They try to serve other people well. And I think one of the things we all need to do better is communicate with the American public that the essence of capitalism, free enterprise, and entrepreneurship is serving other people well. And if you do it, you're rewarded. If you do it well, you're rewarded well. And if you don't do it well, you're immediately punished, and you either get better or you go out of business. And I really saw the two contrasts really interesting, and that in the private sector, it brings out the best nature of people, the desire to serve, to make things better, to collaborate voluntarily with other people. And the government sector, the government's primary role is to tax and regulate and control people. It brings out people's worst natures. And so that's why I got involved.
Wow. Yeah, that's powerful, John. And I want to dig into some of that. And before I did that, I wanted to mention when I was working in government in the White House for about a year in the Trump administration, I found that it was much more transactional than what you would have even in the private sector and other things, and versus what I consider to be relational is what you get more in the private sector and others, because you have to have those relationships in order to build capital and grow your business, versus those transactional sort of exchanges in the market or in the government sector. you don't have to worry about the profitability and everything else because you're taking tax monies from somebody to give it to somebody else. Do you kind of see that as well within your business and government sort of connections?
Totally. And I'll make a slight friendly amendment to that,
Please.
which is there's transactions in both worlds.
Yeah.
But the key difference is that in the private sector, as you've just alluded to, and I've been talking about, in the private sector, those transactions are based upon relationships and they're based upon mutual interest, collaboration, and reciprocity. And most importantly, they're voluntary or they're done through persuasion. In the government sector, there are transactions, but they're coercive in nature.
Yeah.
You must comply, you must submit, you must follow their rules. And those rules often start out with good intentions, but eventually it begins to spin and they start to control things in ways that go way beyond common sense. And that is why we have such an overregulated world we do, and why we have such an overtaxed world that we do.
Yeah. Great points there. I like the way you distinguish that between the voluntary and coercive nature. That's so important. And I hope that we have more free market capitalism again. People give it a bad rap a lot of times now, John, and it's unfortunate because that is where you're able to have voluntary exchanges, no matter your background, no matter your religion, all these things, we can come together. The more control that government has, the less liberty that we're going to have in those processes. And I know you've seen this from so many different areas, but I wondered, like, with your entrepreneurship in the private sector, what did you learn out of that compared to being in public policy and working with at IPI and others?
Well, I was, as I said earlier, I was a political junkie.
Yeah.
I was the guy in my 20s and 30s and 40s who could always go to every cocktail party and tell you who all the Supreme Court justices were. Just ask me, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
I knew who the Senate Majority Leader was. I knew who the Speaker was. I knew who the House Majority Leader was, which most people didn't.
Yeah.
And, I knew all of that. Nobody actually wanted to talk about that. Nobody cared. And so I stood alone in the corner a lot with my cocktail. And what I learned when I actually got involved after that sort of naive, having read a lot about politics prior to getting involved in it, is it was completely different than I realized. I thought that politicians got into politics because they were sort of driven by some sort of agenda. Whether you're Paul Wellstone and you're a classic liberal, or whether you're Tom Coburn and you're a classic conservative, I thought most people came to it with the policy ideas in mind. And what I learned very quickly is there's two kinds of politicians. There are those, both of those are what I would call sincere and honest ideologues for their cause, Wellstone on the left and Coburn on the right. So the main reason people like that, or Reagan or Obama, the reason they got involved in politics was because they had an agenda that they wanted to advance through the political system. I respect both of those, even if I disagree with one's point of view. The second kind of politician is one who adopts a policy agenda to fuel their political ambitions, because politics is a competitive sport. It's a different version of business. It's where you aggregate and accumulate power. You can get some celebrity, and those people are chameleons, and those are not healthy people. I would put Mitt Romney in that category, and frankly, I have to put President Trump in that category. I think President Trump could have been either a lefty or a righty, and he chose the righty path overall. And, whatever you think of President Trump, I think in general, his first term from a policy point of view was pretty good, putting aside style points.
Yeah.
So what I've learned in being involved is that you've got to really understand the motivations of individual politicians. And secondly, how the system works. What I've learned is that political decision makers are under constant pressure. It's a concept I call the political vice. So if you think about it as a three-sided vice, you have pressure from two sides at the bottom side, and the output through the top is based on who's applying pressure. And the kinds of pressure political decision makers are under is media pressure, public opinion pressure when it gets animated and applies it, and then influencer pressure from the bottom. And influencers are very important. Anthony Fauci would be a great example of an influencer. They not only put direct pressure on the political system, they influence the media and the public. And so our problem today is that the left controls the levers of that political vice, putting pressure on the system. And that's why we see so many people that start out conservative move to the left. And we see people who are on the left when they start out move further to the left. And what we're in the middle of right now, and I think Trump is actually the embodiment of this, part of it, along with many others, because there's a lot more of this going on now. We are seeing the right respond and start to build capacity to compete in media, in public opinion, and building its own influencers to try to compete for the power of that political vice.
Wow. Yeah, that's strong. And you call that a vice? Have you written?
Yes, the political vice.
Yeah, I like that.
Actually, thank you. I've actually wrote a book.
Yes.
I wrote it during the during the pandemic, and then it was too tied to the pandemic, so I spent the last year rewriting it.
Okay.
It is now in editing, and I hope to have it published and out and available this fall.
Oh man, that's great. Well, I look forward to that because that's fantastic. I like that a lot. So let's dive into a little bit of your work in Illinois. You were there for a long time. Was it 2007 to 2021? I think.
Yes, I resigned as CEO at the end of 2020, actually, and went back to being a full-time chairman, or a voluntary chairman there in January of 2021.
Yeah. And you were doing a lot of great work there. I mean, that's a tough place to be as someone on the right and having more of these free market liberty ideas and trying to get good public policy done. And IPI continues to do great work. What did you find that were some of the challenges there? I mean, there's a lot of challenges policy-wise, high taxes, and we know people are leaving, and there's Chicago issues and everything else. And it's such a dynamic place overall. If you look at the history of Chicago and the history of Illinois, and I mean, look, the Chicago School of Economics is one of my favorite schools of economics, and Milton Friedman and all those that went there. But I wonder what you say, John, about Chicago, about Illinois, that makes it great, but also where the challenges are.
Yes, everybody is sort of like American exceptionalism. President Obama once said, the Greek thinks they're exceptional too. And it's sort of like that with Illinois. We all think our states are unique.
Yeah.
People from Rhode Island think their state's unique. But I've been all over the country. I grew up in Michigan. I've lived in Maryland and Washington, D.C., and I travel all over the place. And I do work in many states around the country. And Illinois is unique. Other states are unique in different ways. But here's what is distinct about Illinois. Illinois really has a culture where I'll call it the government-centric culture. The nature of its history and how it grew up and how government, particularly the city of Chicago's government, it really is, for lack of a better term, kind of a mobocracy or a feudal system. What I mean by that is, I'll just use Chicago as an example. In Chicago, you have the mayor and then 50 wards with 50 aldermen. It's very much like the feudal system. The mayor is the king. The aldermen for those 50 wards are the dukes, and they kind of control their geographic zone. And so if you want to build a building in your ward, you've got to get the alderman to sign off on it. What the law actually says in terms of regulations, compliance, and zoning doesn't really matter. You've got to get the alderman to sign off. And when you go to see the alderman, he is going to extract value from you, both in terms of campaign contributions or other things he might need you to do to help him out with his political imperatives. So I'll tell you a story to illustrate the mindset really well. A guy I met on an airplane flying along, going to, doesn't matter where we're flying, somewhere during the mayoral race last year. And he was supporting Paul Vallis, who was the Reform Democrat, versus Brandon Johnson, who was running on behalf of the Chicago Teachers Union. Johnson ends up winning by 4 points. Vallis almost pulled off one of the great upsets ever.
Wow.
But this guy was Hispanic, came here from Mexico many years ago and had built a construction business. And a classic American entrepreneurial immigrant startup story, a fantastic story. He's sitting in first class with his family. Amazing guy. We're having this great conversation. And he tells me the story about how in Illinois, when they go to build large electrical facilities for the utility companies like Commonwealth Edison in Illinois, you have to go and meet with the Speaker of the House and the Senate President and various other politicos to make sure everybody's happy with this construction project you're going to do on behalf of the utility. And then you go about it and everybody extracts their pound of flesh and you go about doing it. So then he is expanding and he goes to Maryland, a blue state, a Democrat state. And he's talking to the utility heads there to build a facility for them. And he goes, okay, now when do we go talk to the political leaders? And the utility heads look at him and go, what are you talking about? He goes, well, I know we got to go get the House and the Senate to sign off on this. And they look at him, no, I don't know what you're talking about. No, we don't. We got the permits. We'll just go build. They were completely flummoxed by the idea that the government had any role in these projects. So the mindset in Illinois and in Chicago is that you have to go through government to do your free enterprise efforts. And that's really different than in most states. And what happened over time is essentially Cook County and the city became the Democrat playground, and the rest of the state became the Republican playground. And in a bipartisan way, they had this approach. That all changed after George Ryan was elected in 1998 and then was out in 2002. He became known as a corrupt Republican. He was taking cash bribes. It's a whole long story. But that changed the whole brand of the Republicans, and the Democrats have been dominating ever since. There's a whole reason why the Republicans haven't recovered yet, although we did have a Republican governor win in 2014, had a disastrous one and done term. But the state is not California. It is not New York. It is actually just a slightly left of center state. But the infrastructure on the right has been hollowed out somewhat. And part of the work we've been doing is trying to build that back.
Yeah. Interesting. With something like that, where do you get started? Because it seems like that's a huge uphill battle given the infrastructure and the importance of institutions. It seems like there's a lot of structural problems with the institutions that are there. Where do you start on that?
So that's a great question, and it's the fundamental question. And the way I'll answer it is to say where I started when I first started doing this in 2007.
Yeah.
If I could go back in time and start over, I would not start in the same place that I did. I would do it differently. So I'll tell you both.
Okay.
In 2007, I started with a think tank. I decided I wanted to build out, going back to that political advice, I wanted to build media capacity, grassroots and people capacity, and I want to build influencer capacity. So I started with the think tank to build an influencer policy organization that could impact the politicians directly and the other two sides of the vice. And we did that very successfully. The Illinois Policy Institute has the largest media megaphone in the state. We have larger audiences than the top other media entities like ABC7, NBC5, CBS2, Crane Chicago Business, the NPR affiliate WBEZ. Our audience in general, depending on this various ways you want to mention it in terms of our reach and frequency of audience of consuming news, we're bigger than all of them combined. So we've really built a great operation. Now, how do we translate that into political wins eventually and policy wins eventually is a different subject. But I started out with a think tank. If I had to do it over, what I would recommend in general is that we need to build cultural capacity, which is why I founded the American Cultural Project. We need to be able to compete for mind share long before elections happen. We need to control or influence news assets, entertainment assets, radio, television, podcasts like what you're doing. Yeah. And we need to have capacity to reach people where they live through social media, whether it's TikTok, LinkedIn, Instagram, or whatever your particular platform, or all of the above are, and of course X. And so we've really been focusing in all of my assets that I'm involved with on building that capacity to compete for mind share in American culture. And I think that's where that's the future of what our movement should be doing, is investing more for mind share.
Interesting. And is that kind of that idea where politics is downstream of culture? You got to change the culture first. Is that kind of where that dynamic comes in for you?
That is, I'd say Andrew Breitbart's probably the most famous person that has said that. Many people said it before him, and I certainly subscribe to that politics is downstream of culture. The way I've come to talk about it, though, is that we actually have to get upstream. And what I mean by that is that let's just look at the current election cycle and what's going on. A lot of people are going to, billions of dollars are going to be spent money's being spent right now, but it's kind of like at a level, right? That level is going to go like this. And by the time we get to August, September, October, and then early November, we're going to see the massive spending trying to move 4 or 5% of the electorate to vote one way or the other, and to turn out reluctant voters to vote one way or the other. My point is that we should be spending way earlier in the timeline. So I'll give you a particular example. Brandon Johnson, the mayor of Chicago, put a referendum on the ballot this past spring to put on what we affectionately call the mansion tax, or they call the millionaire's tax. Essentially, any property that changed hands worth over $1 million would be a surtax on that transaction. The city was going to get hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. And this is a city, remember, that in 2020, we did defeat the progressive income tax, but the city of Chicago voted 71% for the progressive income tax. So everybody thought this was going to be a layup. And that vote was going to take place in the spring of 2024. Well, we knew it was coming, and we started the campaign in January of 2023 to defeat it. And we started doing all the work we do through social media and every other aspect of the operation. And we started to discredit Brandon Johnson once he became mayor in April of 2023. And of course, he came from the Chicago Teachers Union, and they were the big advocates of this tax. By the time we got to January of 2024, we had been working upstream for over a year, and we had moved Democrat voters to oppose it, and we defeated it by 8 points. Wow. And that's what I mean by getting upstream. If we had waited to try to compete from January of 2020 for now, we would have lost. They spent $7 million. We spent about $200,000, and we killed them. But that's because we moved people when no one else was paying attention, and we explained the issue to them over the long run rather than trying to sprint the last 100 yards.
Wow. Okay. All right. That's phenomenal. That should be telling for a lot of people, hopefully, that are listening, and influencers and everything else. We got to start this earlier. And it's honestly, John, one of the reasons why I want to start this podcast. Part of it is I kind of feel like my calling is to let people prosper. I used to play drums in a rock band and got in a bad car accident. And anyway, God's kind of calling for me was the life you will prosper. And I got into public policy and, got a PhD in economics. And I also grew up with a single mom. My dad had epilepsy. So they got divorced when I was like 5 or 6. And both of them have passed away now. But it's something that I take this entrepreneurial attitude and figure out how do we start these things early? And how do we have these conversations like we're having now to make those longer term changes? It's also one reason why I ended up not going into academia because those are longer run changes, Hayek's intellectuals and socialism, where you can try to make these changes and hopefully they trickle down and make changes at Main Street. But to me, that was too long. So maybe there's a happy median here that I think you're bringing up some good points about how do you find that place to where the marginal value is going to be greater than the marginal cost? And so that was about a year or so for this particular engagement. But some of the things that I think are longer term costs for us right now, John, for the way the policy seems to be moving, especially on the right by many people, whether it be the lack of free trade and protectionism, the movement towards unions and things of that nature, it's concerning to me, but maybe we need to start now. I don't know where you're at on some of those things, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I'm very concerned about this.
Okay.
I'm a free con signatory, and I've written extensively about why our approach is better. The moment you go to the moment a conservative begins to see the government as the proper instrument to solve a societal problem from a conservative point of view is the moment that we have capitulated.
Yes.
It is appeasement. And we should not be doing that. The government has a very prescribed role, and we should not adopt the left's perspective, which is that the Constitution is outdated and that we have to change the Constitution and all of its limitations on the purview of government in order to solve these big problems. What that says to me is that the intellectual right has lost its way and is becoming bankrupt. Not everybody on the intellectual right,
Sure.
because the free con signatories are courageously countering this.
I'm one of them. I'm one of the signatories, by the way.
I knew you were,
Yes.
and that's why I mentioned it. And I'm so grateful that you are, and I'm proud to be signed with you and all the others. And,
Same.
And I really think what we have to do is, but what is our responsibility and what is our obligation? I call it the Big Ideas Project. What we all need to do is think a lot more imaginatively about the big ideas that are in keeping with classical liberalism, that are keeping with our free con statement, that don't look to the government to solve the problem, but look to a civil society, the private sector to solve those problems that should rightfully not only belong there, but those solutions are better for the poorest, the most vulnerable, and the most challenged among us. We need to make the argument that our ideas are the best way to help the poor, the disadvantaged. Our ideas are the best way to help Black families in urban America or rural America. Our ideas are the best way to help poor white families in rural or urban America or Latino families. Yeah. We need to make those arguments, and we're not doing it enough. And we need imaginative people to start putting forward ideas that are innovative. And a few years ago, at the beginning of the pandemic, tried to convene a working group on what I call the Big Ideas Project as a counter to AOC's The Green New Deal, which people laughed at. It was ridiculous, but it was a very big idea, and now lots of it is in law. And it has changed culture. So we like to laugh at her, but her big idea got currency and got movement.
Yeah.
I'm challenging all of us. What is our big idea? And I'll be writing about that in the future. And I've got several myself.
Okay, good. I can't wait to read it. That'll be great. One of the things I want to talk to you about is, you have Illinois. We talked about some of the institutional issues that are going on there. But you do have some other states that are doing things well. And I think in our system of federalism, which is so important and was the part of the big idea of the founders here in America, that really sets us apart. And it's important for us to have these laboratories of competition to take place to see what works, have the big ideas. I like how you put that, big ideas, and those places that don't. So I live in Texas, and I don't intend really to move. I like living in Texas. It's a little too hot, which we were talking about before we went on, how I like going up north whenever it's cooler during July and other things. But you also have Florida, you have Tennessee, you have some of these other states that are starting to move in this direction. A lot of states are actually starting to cut their income taxes and moving to having no income taxes across the country. I think they're about 15 now, just over the last 3 years, that have had substantial cuts in their income taxes and even passed to eliminating them, which is huge. So you have this competition is happening before our very eyes. And I wonder what you think about this competition in the different states and what's going on.
Those are all great examples, and I'll use another one to illustrate it even, I think, more starkly, which is the different ways governors reacted to the pandemic. Essentially, you had a set of governors, mostly Democrats, a couple Republicans. Governor DeWine in Ohio did not acquit himself super well, and Governor Polis in Colorado was not so bad, actually. But on average, in terms of Democrat governors versus Republican governors, here was the difference. Democrat governors wanted the government to have a command and control, top-down, very authoritarian mandate of how every human being should behave, total risk averse and no risk mitigation and balancing of risk of shutdowns to try to protect people from the pandemic versus shutdowns in terms of the economy and all the downstream effects that happen to people from a mental health, health care treatment point of view, an economic point of view,
education
and a stress point of view.
For K through 12.
Education, what they did to children, all of it. And so you had this command and control. I said earlier that the nature of government through the tax code and regulatory is to control human behavior. You saw that really come out over there. And then on the other side, you saw governors who were Republican on average. Again, there were some exceptions, but whether it's DeSantis or Abbott or Kemp, whichever one you want to pick that you like, certainly Governor Reynolds, Governor Nome. There were plenty of Republican governors. They could not wait to stop the lockdown and unleash human potential and let people make their own best judgment on how to live their life and find their version of flourishing while still being cautious. And I think that really describes the nature of the philosophies of the left and right. I hate the term left and right, but we do live in a somewhat bipolar world, and we talk about these things for shorthand purposes. But really, it's really a school of thought. Do we trust people in general to have agency over their lives and pursue their dreams whatever way they think is best? And should we make a world, from a free econ point of view, that reduces the friction to that? Or do we not trust people? We think we're going to give them narrow lanes in which they can operate, and we're going to control those lanes, and we're going to force them into those lanes. Sometimes it's a bike lane. Sometimes it's an HOV lane. We want to force people into lanes and let them have at it within what we decide is their lane. But other than that, we are going to rope them in and limit them because we know what's best, how to allocate capital opportunity for our society as a whole and for people as individuals. These are very stark differences in the philosophy of the human condition. I am so glad that you and I and others are on the side of believing in human agency and human flourishing and people making their decisions.
Amen. Amen. You know, I was recently talking with Stephanie Slade, and she talked about it as liberalism versus illiberalism, which I think is a good dichotomy because they don't all fall into Republican and Democrat, you know, and especially even conservatives now, you know, and so it's interesting to think about it from that perspective. And I love your example about with COVID and the lockdowns. And I mean, honestly, it's one of the reasons why I left the White House, because when I was in the Situation Room and hearing what's going on, and I noticed that I couldn't do as much as what I would like. I was writing memos saying, look, we cannot go down this route. We need to let the entrepreneur have the opportunity to figure out what's going to work best. And I think we're going to be better off in the longer run from doing that compared to pushing everybody to lock down and everything else. And I think a lot of that was right if we looked back at it. But at the same time, you know, I understood where they were coming from, you know, and everything else. But if you don't have, and this goes back to our conversation earlier, if you don't have strong principles, it's easy to fall into the trap to figure out how this seems to be the best thing to do right now, instead of taking a step back. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, the idea of having strong principles, everybody that's watching your podcast, and I know it's millions now, and congratulations on the success of it. But you do have a very compelling podcast, in part because of what the theme of it is, which is about prosperity and letting people prosper. And we touched on this earlier. The left are the ones who are actually obsessed with material prosperity. Yeah. They can't stop doing comparisons, income inequality, and all the rest of it. And it's actually the right that believes about prosperity of the human spirit. Mm-hmm. It's about the prosperity of the whole of the human experience. It's money is part of it, but some people prosper by working a modest job. My dad remarried, and his new father-in-law worked for the railroad company, putting trains literally back on the tracks. But he had a very modest job, had a very modest income, because he wanted to be home every night when he could be home. He wanted to coach Little League. He wanted to attend all the school events. So he gave up income in order to be there for his family. Other people, they want to work 100 hours a week. They want to be in investment banking or private equity or be a litigator, and they want to compete in that arena and have the financial rewards of it. They're going to sacrifice other aspects of their life, including their family life. We believe in the wholeness of the human person, and that income and economics is just one part of it. There's so much more to the human experience than money.
Yeah.
And I think of some of the happiest times of my life. To this day, some of the happiest times in my life have been when I was practically broke.
Yeah.
But I was living a fulfilling life. I was working, I was going to school, I was studying. I felt like I was growing, and I didn't have a great material life, but man, did I have an enriching life. And I think that's true for a lot of people, whether they want to paint, or they want to coach a little league or a dance class, whatever it might be.
Yeah, great point. One thing that I read was talking about having different mindsets, right? Where you can have a poverty mindset, a rich mindset, or a wealthy mindset. And poverty mindset, I think, is more of a scarcity. There's always something scarcity. I fall into that trap a lot with my wife and talking about our different things that were going on. And then there's a rich mindset where you just have a lot of money, to your point about the left. And, you could be rich, but it doesn't mean you're wealthy. I think the wealthy mindset is something that you feel like it's more holistic, to your point, with educational, spiritual. My Christian faith is really important to me. I feel like I'm doing my calling of letting people prosper and doing this show and everything else. And so that brings me of serving God. In my view, serving God helps me to have this wealthy mindset that no matter if I don't have a lot of money, I'll still be wealthy and maybe not be rich, but not live into that poverty mindset that keeps people down too much. And oftentimes it draws in politicians who have the same sort of scarcity mindset where they want to start directing resources to get people out of that. But you can't do that through redistribution. You can't do that through public policy. There's a lot more that's at stake. Going back to your discussion about culture, that you can't change culture with this policy. You can try, but it's going to come out with bad outcomes in the future. And we're seeing so much of that now as government becomes too large across the country. And so I don't know if there's anything else that you have to mention on that, but that's something I wanted to bring up here.
Oh, I love all of it. I think one of the best recent cases on the government mindset about trying to solve people's problems and thinking about materialism is the work that former Senator Phil Gramm and his colleagues have done on that fact that there is not income inequality. And they did a study of the 5 quintiles of the American population. And when you take into account transfer payments and all the things that the government does to try to help people who are struggling and suffering, that there really is no income inequality. And what's even more interesting about it is, I can't remember the numbers, so I'm going to make up numbers, but they'll be illustrative of the point. The median household income, for the sake of this discussion, let's say $75,000, and that's that middle quintile. The people below that, on average, are making somewhere around like $64,000, $65,000, and below that, $62,000, when adjusted for all the transfer payments. So they're not that far away from what the median is, but they hardly work in comparison to people in that middle quintile because the welfare system rewards people for not working. That's an attack on human flourishing.
Yes.
That's an attack on human dignity. That's an attack on human prosperity of a non-material kind, encouraging people not to work, taking away their agency, telling them it's good to sit around and not be productive. The analog to that is, I'm as you can tell by my gray hair, I'm not at the beginning of my life, but certainly past the middle, perhaps, just a touch. And so I know a lot of people who are retiring and have retired, and it breaks down very quickly. There's 2 kinds of retirees. The ones that are highly engaged, they may have quit working in their vocation, but they're certainly working and highly engaged in something else, and they go on to live fruitful, full lives that are prosperous in a non-material sense. Then there are those who've retired, they couldn't wait, and they can't wait to get on the couch and ride it out. Those people deteriorate on average so fast and die much younger. The data on this is overwhelming. That's what we're doing at the other end of the welfare state. We're encouraging people for that worse outcome. It's a shameful thing that the left is doing.
It really
too many
is.
On the right, frankly.
Yeah. No, you're right. You're right. Well, let's talk a little bit about this museum that you have going on now. We were talking entrepreneurship and everything. But what about this museum you got going on, John?
Well, I'm very excited that I'm involved with the great Lauren Darty, who's from Waco, Texas. She's the president of the Entrepreneur Hall of Giants. We are going to build an Entrepreneur Hall of Fame, but we're going to call it the Hall of Giants because we like that naming convention better. And it's not going to be a museum like anything else you've ever been to. It is going to be an experiential entertainment facility. So the way I like to describe it is think a little bit of Hollywood, think a little bit of Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, think a little bit of Disney World, and think a little bit of a nightclub that you go to dancing with your friends. So we're going to build an entertainment facility that celebrates and honors and explains how entrepreneurs engage in our society, in our free enterprise system, in our capitalist system, and change our lives for the better. And the main thing we really want to do, besides making it a great and entertaining experience, the most important thing is when people walk away, they'll connect the dots that literally every physical thing any of us have in our lives other than our physical selves was created because an entrepreneur had an idea to start a business and to build that cup that is holding your coffee, or the glass that is holding your water, or the chairs that you and I are sitting on, the computers we're both talking through. Every single physical thing we have in our lives was created by an entrepreneur existing in our free enterprise system. And people have lost sight of that. Every dollar that the government spends starts in the private sector because of an entrepreneur. Every charitable dollar that serves people well and changes people's lives for the better starts in the private sector because of an entrepreneur. I want to build a facility and have a national narrative impact in culture that reconnects the American people with the idea of how amazing entrepreneurs are and what the value is they create through our lives to enrich our lives in the most amazing ways, whether it's going on a ride at Disney World, driving in your new Range Rover or your new Ford Explorer or whatever your particular choice is, or building a new house, whatever it may be.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And where will it be located?
That's the first question we always get. We don't know yet.
All right.
We're in a full site selection research process, but it'll be somewhere wonderful where lots of people can come to it. And this will be about a 3 to 5 year build. So we're at the very beginning stages of it, and we're having a lot of fun with it.
That's amazing. Well, it's a spontaneous order, right? Like Hayek, you got to see where the market process leads you. So I love that. I'm really excited about it. Do you have any key entrepreneurs that you would want to mention that will be a part of this?
Our very first supporter, whose permission I have to mention, is Mike Kaiser. Mike Kaiser is a legendary golf course developer. He has something like 10 or 15 golf courses in the top 100 in the country. If you're a golfer, you'll know Bandon Dunes and many others. And Mike was our first donor to this project. Mike is a multiple entrepreneur of many things and a great American philanthropist and a great man. And there are others that I'm working on that I'm not, and a couple others that have supported, but I don't have their permission to mention them publicly. So we have 4 early donors, and we're working on some mega donors that I hope to be able to announce sometime down the road. Great.
Well, I'm looking forward to that. And as you mentioned, Lauren Doherty is awesome and amazing. And so I'm glad that she's president.
She is fantastic.
She is. And so, and so are you, John. You're a great entrepreneur, a great American, and I'm really thankful and blessed that you've joined us here on the show. And God bless you and your family.
Thank you so much, and back to you. And thanks for having me on. I'm really grateful to be with you.
Yeah, thanks so much, and it's really a pleasure to have you on. For the audience, I hope you enjoyed our discussion. Go out and leave us a 5-star rating wherever you get this, and share it with your friends and family. They might be entrepreneurs or want to know more about entrepreneurship and public policy, and this is the way to do it. We've talked about a lot of things today. You also find the show notes at vanceginn.substack.com or go to vanceginn.com. There's a lot of good information and insights there as well. But until next time, let people prosper.